Do you ever look at somebody else's life and kind of wish that you had what they had? Maybe it's a life circumstance, maybe it's a job, or maybe it's a relationship with God. I think for me, this happens more often than not when I look at maybe pastors that I look up to or spiritual mentors, and it just seems like they have this connection with God, or they have this ability to read God's word or enter into a church or a life group setting and really connect with God in a way that I desire. And I see that in the life of Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 34, God's grace and his justice are on display as God showing him the promised land and yet not allowing him to enter. But in the midst of this kind of powerful end of his life scene, he's 120 years old. It says that his eyes aren't tired, his body isn't weak, and yet him and God have this intimacy, this deep relationship. And I always wonder, man, Moses, how'd you get there? And recently I was reading a familiar story, Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, and it struck me that about 5 times Moses seriously doubts God's call in his life. Right? Moses shows up on the scene, kind of on doing his daily thing in the desert, and all of a sudden there's this burning bush, and he says, let me go over and see this sight, which is probably always a good idea if there's a burning bush happening. Like, you go over, and because he goes over, God chooses to speak and enter into that moment, and they have this back and forth about God being the God that's about to rescue his people out of Egypt. But then Moses, a couple of times, at first he says, God, who am I? Like, who am I that you would send me? And then he says this in chapter 3, he goes, suppose I go to the Israelites, right? Like, okay, God, like he starts negotiating almost, like, suppose I do go. And then God tells him that he is I am, that he is this Yahweh, the God that always has been and always will be. And after this eloquent speech on God's end of giving Moses his name, I love that Moses says this in the beginning of chapter 4. What if they don't believe me or listen to me? And then God gives him these 3 really powerful signs. Throw your staff on the ground and it'll become a snake. And Moses runs from it. It's this beautiful moment. Put your hand in your cloak and it becomes leprous. And then he pulls it back out and it's healed. And then he says, if they still don't believe you in Egypt, pour some water from the Nile on the ground and it will become blood. And then Moses says, I haven't really ever been eloquent in speech. And he has this doubt again of God. And then after God says, like, I made your tongue. I'm the God that created the literal human body. I know how it works. And then Moses says this in chapter 4. He says in verse 13, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send somebody else. And I think this is a really relatable Moses for me, a God that I have history with, that I've experienced with. This is an 80-year-old Moses. At 40 years old, Moses murders somebody and runs away from Egypt. He spends another 40 years in the desert, kind of doing his own thing, gets married, and then God meets him at 80 years old, and still he has these moments of doubt and these, but what's your name? And what if they don't believe me? And I'm not eloquent of speech. And I'm blown away that between 80 and 120 years old, there's another 40-year period of waiting. And the more I read the Bible, the more I see that God is a God that meets people in the waiting. And I just think that's a really encouraging thing for me to hear right now. I look at the last year or maybe the last couple years even, and in the midst of waiting or in the midst of really honestly impatience in my life, I'm encouraged that God is a God of waiting and that he, all throughout the Bible, he shows up to people in their lives and asks them to ask the question, not when will I get out of this season of waiting, but what can I get out of this season of waiting? Right? Abraham, 100 years old when he has Isaac. David, anointed king, 22 years later will become king. Joseph, imprisoned for 17 years before he leads Egypt. God is a God that meets us in the waiting. And the same God that is the God that meets them in the waiting is the God that meets me in the waiting. And I want to lean into that in this season and be encouraged by the fact that God, he sees me where I'm at and he meets me right here. And would I not waste that season of waiting because he meets me and wants to teach me something right here, right now. May that be encouraging for us this week. Thanks, Dosers. See you tomorrow.